and what is now his stump speech as the president tries to rewrite American history to conform with his socialist worldview. According to the president, prosperity in America has never come from the top down. It's come from the bottom up, or maybe the middle up. The president is attributing the gains that America has made as a nation to the strength of our middle class. Obama says a strong middle class is what grows the economy. Well, President Obama needs to understand that we didn't always have a strong middle class. Where does Obama think that strong middle class came from? All nations have a middle class. You know, what differentiates the American middle class was its affluence, was its purchasing power. But we didn't begin with a strong middle class. What Obama has to understand is that it was capitalism that made the middle class strong. And how did it work? Well, it was from the top down. That's what happened. You had entrepreneurs who started businesses. You had capitalists who saved. You had investment in machines, in factories, in labor-saving devices that increased the productivity of the middle class. And because the middle class were more productive, thanks to investments that were made by the capitalists and by the entrepreneurs, they were able to earn higher real wages. Their living standards rose as a function of the investments and the hard work and the ingenuity of the people who the president wants to discredit, the people who are on the top, the people who made the sacrifices to accumulate the capital, that took the risks to create the businesses, that produced the products, that hired those workers, that made the middle class what it is. You see, President Obama, he's got the economic cart before the horse. America isn't great because we have a strong middle class. It's because America was great that we were able to produce a strong middle class. The president likes to credit Henry Ford and use him as an example because he was paying his workers high wages, and therefore they were able to buy his cars, and it was because his workers made high wages, and that's why the economy grew. First of all, not all of Henry Ford's customers were his employees. Plenty of people who didn't work for Henry Ford were able to buy those cars. But the reason that the middle class was able to buy those cars was because Henry Ford, with the introduction of the assembly line, which he pioneered, he discovered or invented that process, and using capital that had been accumulated by the rich, Henry Ford was able to bring down the cost of production so that the middle class could afford to buy the cars that this production process made more affordable. So again, he's got it backwards. And how was it that Henry Ford was able to pay his workers so much money? Because they were more productive as a result of the machines that he provided them with. And why did he pay his workers a lot of money? Because he didn't want to have to constantly retrain workers. He was losing workers prior to that, and so he raised the pay, but the only reason he was able to raise the pay of his workers was because they were more productive thanks to his processes, his ingenuity, the risks that he took, and the risks that other capitalists took who funded his ventures. Also part of the president's stump speech is to pretend that the only time we really tried, capitalism was during the Bush years. That during the Bush presidency, we cut taxes for the rich, and we reduced government spending on vital social programs like education and health care. And because we did that, the economy fell apart. We had the financial crisis. Therefore, according to Obama, we tried lower taxes and less government spending, and the result was a disaster. Therefore, what we need to produce growth and prosperity is higher taxes on the rich and more government spending. Now, I guess in this limited view of U.S. history, President Obama ignores the century or more of history where we had no taxes at all on the rich, where the government didn't spend anything on education or health care. Let's look at the 19th century, because American history didn't begin with George W. Bush. It began with the Founding Fathers. And the country that they gave us was a country of extremely limited government, where the rich paid basically no taxes at all. I mean, we all paid taxes, but they were tiny. There was no income tax on individuals or corporation. There was no inheritance tax, nothing. There were no Social Security taxes. We were a free country. And the government spent nothing. The federal government spent nothing, not a nickel on education, not a nickel on health care. And it was because the government was so small, because there were no taxes, because the government wasn't spending, that's what created the American miracle. That's where the middle class came from. We became the richest country on the world because we didn't tax the rich, or anybody else for that matter, and we didn't have all this government spending. Now, if the president says, gee, in the absence of high taxes on the rich and lots of government spending on education and health care, you can't have economic growth, how does he explain the 19th century? How does he explain the century that made America, where we had a faster growth in our standard of living than at any point in history? We had more growth in the 19th century than we had in the 20th. And of course, we had more growth in the first part of the 20th century than in the second. And the difference is government. As government got bigger, economic growth slowed. As government created more barriers to growth, to entrepreneurship, as we taxed and regulated more, we suffered. The economy suffered, and so we didn't see the living standard increases that we had when we had less government. You know, the truth is, if we actually had all of the high taxes on the rich and all of the government programs that Obama says are necessary to economic growth, if we had all that from day one, from the very birth of the Republic, if it was written into our Constitution, we probably never would have expanded beyond our original 13 colonies. I mean, can you imagine? What about the people who settled the West, in the horse and buggies? They caravanned out, they went through hostile Indian territory to settle the West. You think they would have ever gotten off the ground if they had to deal with the IRS, if they had to deal with OSHA, with the Federal Transportation or Highway or whatever kind of rules and regulations? Can you imagine these covered wagons all loaded up with, with safety stuff and all helmets and whoever knows what and environmental legislation? And what if they had to keep track of their payroll? And nothing would have happened. In fact, if we had offered the settlers, if the founding fathers had offered the colonies the type of government that Obama says is necessary, not only would this country never have prospered, it never would have been created. I don't think we would have got any support for a revolution. People would have preferred the king. They would have preferred King George to the type of government that Obama thinks we need. So President Obama is wrong. We don't owe our success to government spending and high taxes. It's exactly opposite. And America has always grown from the top down. Trickle down, they want to discredit it, but that's what happens. That is capitalism. That is Adam Smith. That is the invisible hand. That's what makes economies prosper. President Obama needs an economics lesson. President Obama needs a history lesson. The president needs to understand that America's strong middle class was not an accident. We created that middle class because we succeeded in creating a society that maximized freedom and liberty and minimized government. It was because we weren't encumbering people with high taxes and government regulation that we were able to create the strong middle class that the president now wants to credit for our success. But if we forget why we were so successful in the past, we are going to undermine that success in the future. In his efforts to exalt the contribution of the middle class, what President Obama is really doing is signing the death warrant for the middle class. Obama's strategy will destroy the middle class by destroying the people that helped create it, by destroying capitalism, the free market, by discrediting the entrepreneur and the hard work and the sacrifice of those who created the prosperity that so many other people enjoyed. And it wasn't an accident that so many great men did so many great things in this country. It was because the government left them alone. They were free to be great here, and they were great. They didn't have those freedoms in other countries, and more people came here. People immigrated to America to do great things because the government let them. And if we are going to destroy that incentive, if we are going to layer this economy with more regulations and more taxes because we don't think that matters, because we think as long as we have a middle class, and if the president thinks that the middle class can be created by the Federal Reserve printing money and just spending it into circulation, if the government thinks we can make the middle class richer by making the upper class poorer, he has got a rude awakening ahead of him. The unfortunate problem is, since a lot of people associate George Bush with freedom or limited government or tax cuts, it makes it easy for the president to blame the financial crisis of 2008 on capitalism, on the tax cuts, even though logically you can't do it. Emotionally, that's what the president does. That's why, if you remember, I did a lot of television interviews back in 06, 07, 08, where I was debating right-wing economists who thought everything was great. And one of the problems I constantly said was, when this phony economy falls apart, it's unfortunate that not enough free market economists were doing what I was doing, because they were giving the free market a bad name, and they were setting us up once the market collapsed to be the fall guys, and basically handing this script to Obama to try to blame the demise on too little government. The reality is, for all their talk, yes, Bush cut taxes, but taxes were still high. And they didn't cut government spending. Spending kept growing under the Bush administration. In fact, he was one of the biggest spenders since Lyndon Johnson. And that we had a lot more regulation. They weren't repealing regulations, they were adding regulations on top of a pile of regulations. But somehow the Bush administration is known as the one that slashed regulations to the bone and, slashed government spending, slashed taxes, and produced a collapse. That is a complete myth. But unfortunately, Obama is able to sell that false narrative because too many people, or not enough people, understand the truth. That's why we've got to do what we can to make sure that the truth does get out. So if you have the opportunity, why not share this video, favorite it, or like it, or whatever you can do, so more people can get a different spin on the lie that Obama is trying to tell regarding American history and regarding capitalism. That's it for today.